1 Corinthians 12 and verse 28. And it says this: God has appointed these in the church. First, apostles. Second, prophets. Third, teachers. After that, miracles. Then, gifts of healings, helps, administrations, varieties of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Are all workers of miracles? Do all have gifts of healings? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I show to you a more excellent way. I want to pick out a couple of words in this which to me show something of just how full all God's purposes are. And I'm going to pick out these two words in verse 28 of helps and administrations. One of the interesting things about these spirituals is that we don't have definitions for any of them. Many people think you do, and you'll get some people. You may say, well, what's a word of wisdom? And they'll give you a definition of a word of wisdom. But actually there's no Bible definition of a word of wisdom. Or someone will tell you, yes, I know what a word of knowledge is, but that actually there isn't a Bible definition for a word of knowledge. Or they'll say, well, yes, I know what faith is, but actually there isn't a Bible definition for what faith is as one of these spirituals. Or they'll say, we know what discerning of spirits is, but actually there's no definition. So the danger is that we put these labels on things. They're man-made labels, and we give them man-made definitions. And then the danger is that we sort of try and work it the other way around. You know, I sometimes use this silly illustration. I say that if you call a dog a goldfish, it doesn't do the dog any harm at all, unless you get the manual on how to keep goldfish. And then you decide that this is the way you're going to look after your dog. And you're going to make a tank for it full of water. And you're going to feed it with ants' eggs. Now, the fact that you've given it the wrong label is going to have a very serious impact upon the dog. And it doesn't matter what labels you put upon people in one sense. It only matters when, if you say to this person, he's an apostle. It doesn't matter what you call him in one sense, unless he goes to the Bible with that label and says, I'm an apostle, so I can do what an apostle does. An apostle do this, 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 and this, and this, and this. And now the fact that he's got the wrong label is going to have a real big impact upon the way he's living his life. So we've got these references here, and we've got this reference to helps and administrations. Now, what does helps mean? Well, the word really just means someone who supports. It means to kind of take hold of someone to help them. That isn't very complicated, is it? Just to help them, just to support. Now, you might have expected in this big list of things, because we've got apostles in this list, and you think, well, these are the super people, aren't they? These are the kind of the super ministries. Well, one of these super ministries is this thing called helps. And apparently this kind of help we're talking about here is actually, it is a spiritual. It isn't a natural. It's not just because someone has a helpful disposition as a natural person. These are special abilities that God gives to people in his church to be helps, to be supporters. And there's another word that's used for the word help in the Bible. It's a different Greek word, but it's got the same kind of idea. And I want to show it to you because I think this is really quite fascinating. If you turn with me to the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. And I'm going to pick out kind of two words for you. This is verses 17 to 18. This is the shipwreck. And this is an amazing piece of writing. It really is very exciting if you understand what's happening. Ships in ancient times, these big ships that used to cross the Mediterranean, they always used to pull behind them a small boat. It would be big enough maybe to have maybe 10 men in it. And the purpose of this small boat, it was a rowing boat usually, and the purpose was that you used it to help the big boat. If you'd got a lot of wind behind you, you could just go and you didn't need the big boat. But if you were coming into harbour, it was very difficult to steer those big boats delicately. So what you had is the equivalent of a kind of the ancient world's tugboat. And you brought this little boat around to the front and you attached it to the front, and then 10 men got in the front and they rowed and they pulled the head of the boat round to get it into a harbour. Or sometimes if they were at sea and the waves were contrary to them and they needed to get the boat in head on facing the winds, they would put this little boat at the front of it and they would pull the big boat into the front so it was facing the wind. So it was a vital part of these big boats. Okay, now in verse 16 it says this: "And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff," that's a little boat, "with difficulty." What it means is that this storm was so tumultuous that they almost lost this little boat. Now, if they'd lost this little boat, it would have made their life even more dangerous, because they wouldn't be able to do the fine tuning of guiding when they were trying to get into a safe place. And what they did is they actually pulled this boat up onto the top. They pulled it up so that it was safe. It was kind of now on board the ship. And then it says this, verse 17, "When they had taken it on board," now the New King James Version says, "they used cables to undergird the ship." The Old King James Version says they used helps. Now what they're doing here is, as I say, this is really an amazing picture of a first century storm. This ship was under threat of being torn apart by the ferocity of the storm. And what they used to do in ancient times is that they would get someone and he would actually dive, taking a rope with him under the boat. He'd come up the other side and they would then attach these two parts of the rope together, and they would use winches to tighten it. I think they call it frapping. Any sailors amongst us? I think they call it frapping. It means you tie the thing very, very tight, so that these wooden boards that were threatening to spring apart with all the power that was going on have now got a sort of a belt around them, and they're tightening the belt so that it's held steady. So that's what they did with this little boat. They pulled the boat on top to keep it safe, and then what they did is that they put these helps underneath. Now the reason I like this is because the safety of the boat depended upon these helps. The New King James Version calls them cables, but it's actually explaining them, it's not translating them. The word is helps. I like it simply because these helps are invisible. They're not the kind of things that you would notice. They're actually under the water. But if these helps are not doing their job, if these ropes have not been wound tight, this boat is going to sink. This boat is dependent upon invisible nobodies. It's dependent upon things that no one is ever going to cheer these ropes and say these ropes kind of saved the ship. But in fact they did. The interesting thing is there's another word in this particular story that comes up. And it comes up in verse 11, where it says this: "Nevertheless," I've gone back in time. "Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded." You see, Paul had said we shouldn't have done this, but they decide that they'll take somebody else's advice. Verse 11: "Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul." So they decided they'd make a run for it and they'd take a risk and they'd go to sea. This word helmsman is the word that's translated administrations in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. If you put that into there, if you put those ideas into there, you get an interesting kind of picture. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Amongst the spirituals, necessary revelations of the life of Christ that he has put into the church, you have helps which work invisibly but are absolutely necessary to the survival of the ship. And you also have these people who are called administrations, or steersmen or helmsmen. Now obviously a steersman is a very conspicuous person. He's probably the one who's going to get all the credit for saving the boat. Although actually it's the ropes that saved the boat in some circumstances. And it's interesting to me that you've got these two ideas kind of right side by side here. There are all kinds of manifestations of the Spirit that God has put in his body. And there are distinctions in them. They are different one from another. But we must be careful that we don't end up saying, I wish the whole body could be an eye, or I wish the whole body could be an ear, or I wish the whole body could be something that's really conspicuous and spectacular that everyone would notice it. Because it doesn't work like that. And yet these are absolutely necessary. That's one of the things that Paul has to say. They're absolutely necessary. Let's have a little look at some of these manifestations. As I've said, that there are no definitions for them. But if we go back in time a little bit to chapter 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7, it says this: But the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. For to one is given, and I'm going to change it a little bit here to make a point. There are lots of words "the" in our particular translation now. That "the" is the definite article. And the definite article doesn't appear in this particular verse. So it ought to read like this: For to one is given a word of wisdom through the Spirit. To another, a word of knowledge through the same Spirit. To another, you could actually put a faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healings by the same Spirit. To another, a working of miracles. To another, a prophecy. To another, a discerning of spirits. To another, kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of tongues. The reason I'm saying that you don't have "the" there is, I want to make this point, is that every single one of these manifestations is in a sense a one-off manifestation. It's not someone who has acquired a skill so that they can just use these things whenever they want to them. These manifestations that God gives are, each one is a unique event. Each one is a unique moment where God makes these things possible. And he's speaking here again about this amazing diversity, but the distinctiveness too of these gifts. And did you notice in verse 25 when he spoke of these things, he said that the reason for this was that there should be no schism in the body, no splits in the body, but that the members of the body should have the same care one for another. This little phrase, the same care for one another, lies at the heart of these 3 chapters. These spirituals are not just spectacular events in the life of the church. They are ways in which the body cares for itself. They are the ways in which we care for one another. And if we have any other motivation other than this, caring for the body, these spiritual functions will not have the effect that God intends them to have. That's why we go on to chapter 13, and why Paul says that the dynamic of these spirituals, the engine, the thing that keeps these things working in the way that they ought to work, is love. It's not because I want to excel. It's not because I want to become better at prophesying or give spectacular prophecies that come wonderfully true, or that there are amazing healings take place. And people say, look at this, how wonderful these healings are. The purpose of this is so that we can care for one another. These are not opportunities for us to increase our own personal skill or fame or any of that. These are opportunities for us to care for one another. And I think that's one of the greatest encouragements, because there are some people, and if you say to them, I'm thinking of somebody now, I won't put a name to it, you would know who I meant. If you were to say to this person, look, you've got a responsibility to care for, to do this, you've got a responsibility to pray, this person would dissolve in feelings of inadequacy, because they'd say, well, no, I can't do it. I just can't do it. I'm not that kind of person. I'm too shy. I'm too weak. I don't have this. If you were to say to this person, look, God wants you to care for this person, that different attitude would actually encourage this person to share. I know it. Can you see the point I'm trying to make? It isn't. There are some people who respond to challenges. Be brave, take a cold shower. There are some people who like that kind of thing. And there are some people who are just crushed by the very prospect of it. But if you say to these people, the purposes of these manifestations, the purposes of these spirituals, is actually to enable you to care for the body, I think they might start praying for some of these spirituals. They wouldn't pray for them as spectacular things because they wouldn't draw attention to themselves. They wouldn't want that. They would far prefer to remain at the back where nobody notices them. But if you say to them, look, actually, these are part of the way in which God has ordained that the body cares for itself, I think they might be encouraged to seek God for some of these things here. One of the things that Paul says in chapter 13, I know I'm going through this very quickly, is that he says that we have, as grown people, we have a responsibility in the church to take responsibility, to be personally accountable for the way that we live our lives. And he says this in verse 11, and I think this is such an important verse that it's easy to miss this. He says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, notice who takes the responsibility when he becomes a man. When I became a man, I put away childish things. This is one of the signs of maturity, that a person takes personal responsibility. They understand that they are not, this ship that we're on isn't a cruise. It's actually a working vessel, and everybody on this ship is going to have to kind of work. It's all part of this, and we're going to have to take responsibility, because this is the only way that this body really functions. If every single person is rightly related to Jesus the Lord, who is the head, and accepts responsibility from him to live their lives in a way which isn't childish. A child takes no responsibility for anything. Is that right? It's one of the things we have to kind of teach them to do. They take no responsibility for anything. But a man, this is one of the signs, he takes responsibility. When I became a man, I put away childish things, he says. Okay, I'm going to pause for a minute. Let's stop, and then I'm going to kind of do something which is a bit more complicated at the end. Let's stop for a minute.